very much for joining us in this panel, Financing the Transition to Nature Positive Climate Resilient Economies. In their recent policy brief, Nature Finance, the COP27 and COP28 champions state, and I quote, the global economy is fully dependent on nature. There is no pathway to a thriving economy, to achieving 1.5% degrees under the Paris Agreement, or to an inclusive, prosperous society without shifting capital out of activities which are destroying natural ecosystems and into nature positive solutions. Indeed, the global economic system depends on nature. With half of global GDP, some $44 trillion, moderately to highly dependent on economic services. As the champion stated, our current economic model, which extracts nature for short term benefit, is inequitable and unsustainable. Most economic activity undervalues nature. The World Bank estimates that the collapse of select ecosystem services provided by nature, such as wild pollination, food from marine fisheries, and timber from forests, could lead to annual global GDP loss around 2.7 trillion US dollars by 2030. Despite its importance, there has been a global average decline of 69% in species population since 1970. Latin America and the Caribbean is at the very top of the list with an alarming 94% drop, followed by Africa 66% and Asia Pacific with 55%. After COP27, it became clear the objectives of the Paris Agreement cannot be met without nature. Nature-based solutions are a critical ally on the path to reach net zero emissions by 2050, as they have the potential to not only supply over one-third of cost-effective climate change mitigation needs by 2030, but also to contribute to adaptation goals while supporting economies and future-proofing development priorities. The mutually reinforcing dynamics between biodiversity loss and climate change make engaging nature unavoidable for any stakeholder that has made net zero pledges and has started implementing nature-based solutions to accelerate climate action. The good news is that if we invest in nature, ecosystem services could generate more than $15 billion per year in economic value for Latin America and the Caribbean through activities such as water purification, flood regulation, or insect pollination. A nature positive economy could generate up to $10.1 trillion in annual business value globally and create an estimated 395 million jobs by 2030, transforming the three economic systems responsible for nearly 80% of nature: food, infrastructure, and energy. In our own region, countries like Chile are beginning to integrate natural capital values into economic and policy decisions. Ecuador and Barbados are converting debt for nature, and we have seen several innovative bond issuances that integrate biodiversity KPIs, including Uruguay's sustainability-linked bond. We at the IDB will continue to develop instruments and partnerships to support transition to nature positive through support for these innovative financial approaches, such as nature for debt swaps, sustainability bonds, and other nature-backed financial derivatives. We announced earlier this week our commitment to increase our climate and biodiversity finance, to develop more guarantees to generate funding for conservation, and our leadership of work to support MDB tracking of nature positive finance. We've also led the way on work on biodiversity credits and mechanisms for trading biodiversity assets in the Amazon and other ecosystems, and we expect to continue this work. Moreover, we continue to use lessons learned on carbon markets to set high integrity and governance principles that promote transparency, inclusion, and high-quality metrics for transactions so that there is integrity in the emergence of these new kinds of assets and markets. This conversation today is about innovative financial instruments to conserve and restore ecosystems, improve lives, and generate profit to investors through regenerating ecosystems. Even more, it is about how to reboot our systems and correlate economic growth with ecosystem health, and it is an invitation to co-create the world we want to live in. With that, I am pleased to give the floor to our moderator, my colleague Juan Pablo Bonilla, manager of the Climate Change and Sustainability Division at the Inter-American Development Bank, who will present our esteemed panelists. And thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Anabel. And for us, for the IDB, it's an honor to have this panel. I would like to introduce Sylvie, met a good friend and a great leader, the Ambassador of Environment from France. Sylvie, it's a pleasure having you here. Douglas, I'm sorry, but we call him Doug. It's been a long journey since we started working together for the String Sync Exchange Group. We have the WEF. I'm sorry, I'm not gonna pronounce your name to do it in a right way. WWF, the VP for Climate. It's a pleasure having you here. And we have the president, the CEO of a company that is doing something very innovative in Colombia. So the idea is to have a view from different stakeholders about innovation in nature and about the challenge that we have to scale this up. We're gonna start with the remarks from Sylvie, and then we will start the conversation.
Thank you very much, and good, I don't know if it's morning or afternoon, somewhere in between to all of you. Really glad to be here. I have been following, I must say, the work of the Inter-American Development Banks for, I should not say decades, but it's true, it's decades now. And I can really testify that it is and has been a leader in terms of incorporating the environment agenda into their operations. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why I'm here today. We are all facing the same issue, which is indeed, how do we identify and find the financial solutions to invest in nature and to make sure that we make development possible within a nature that is finished, as we know. There are a couple of things that need to be done. The first one, I would say, is the multilateral international framework. It has to exist, although I know that all of you that are not negotiators would certainly think that it's a lot of time spent for very little outcome. But if you don't have that outcome, then in a way you don't have a kind of a guide. So I think in the nature part, what happened in Montreal through the COP15 is very useful to also make sure that you can refer to that. And I'm seeing that every day in the negotiation we have with countries. You have a target 3 that says that we collectively have to protect 30% of the land and 30% of the ocean. It is a target that is very general. That's why it was accepted. So it does not mean that everyone has to do it. But on the other hand, it's very interesting to see how much each country is looking at themselves and seeing how much can I do out of this 30. And for those countries that could do more, it's all also our I would say, our objective to help them do more if they can. So it's a reference. I would say that there are several issues that are interesting in the Kunming-Montreal Agreement related to finance. One is that it is very clearly stated that finance has to be aligned with the goal of the Kunming-Montreal. This is, taking the Paris Agreement alignment objective to the biodiversity, but it means something because then government have to act. There is a target 18 that says that all the negative subsidies have to be eliminated. If you don't get the price right, anyway, it doesn't work. And then you have the target 19 that basically say that we need to collectively double the money that we are putting on biodiversity globally, nationally, internationally. And then the international level, we have committed to tripling. It's not small, but a lot needs to be indeed brought to the international community to preserve environment. So international level has some role to play. Then the national level comes up immediately after. Because if you don't have the regulatory framework, if you don't have all the incentives in place, if your incentives are wrong, you can do whatever you want, but you will fail. So you basically have, as a country, to really look into what you can do. I'm not here to say, a lot about France, but I'm really pleased to say that we are the first country, I think, to have done our NBSAP, which is our National Plan for Biodiversity that was launched a week ago, and that is fully aligned with the Global Biodiversity Framework. It is something important. When we did it, even as developed countries, you would say, okay, easy perhaps, not easy. Look at the indicators and how are you going to report and how are you going to make sure that you're going in the right direction. It is not so simple and it has to be done. And then the third thing is obviously do it then at the more micro level, so project and all that. And I would like to say that the role, well, first of all, sorry, before that, I think I want to say that also having done all that, it also triggers direct shift and movement in the private sector. So it's the international, national regulatory framework, and then it triggers indeed private sector. And there is something that in the Kunming-Montreal agreement was also very important, which is this target 15 that asks for the private sector to report on their impact and dependencies. This is something that is much more ambitious than in the climate arena. So countries are starting to put in place regulatory framework that will have the private sector basically report on their impact on nature and the impact that nature has on their own business. That is going to be a paradigm shift if it really happens. So then, having done all that, we move to the project side. And I think the only thing I would like to say, because there is quite a lot, but that beyond going project by project, as we do usually in international development, what is really interesting and where IDB has been a leader is really to look at new and innovative ways, in a way, to finance nature. Nature is not a straightforward funding object. Let me be very clear. And so you have been piloting and supporting, and I think Latin America in general has been a place where there has been quite a lot of new things, from the PFPs that WWF has done, to the debt swap, to other schemes that I'm sure everyone is going to speak about, so I'm not going to do that. I just want to say that it is important that there is one continent that is so gifted in terms of biodiversity, that has precisely this willingness and the opportunity to have a regional bank that is supporting this willingness. And that makes me feel, hopeful that we are going to be able to scale up those tools and those and everything you've been doing. And I hope that other continents are going to copy. And it's bad to copy when you're a children, but it's very good when you become an adult if you see that good things can be replicated. So I'm going to stop here, and I would like to thank all of you for being here. Thank you.
No, thank you. CV, when we were in Montreal, we talked exactly what you were mentioning, that challenge from the national level to go down to private sector, and also to different levels of, even with cities. We had yesterday a panel of mayors of the Amazon here talking about how to integrate biodiversity into city planning, for example. And as the vice president was saying, IDB has done therefore nature swaps. We had the Prime Minister of Barbados here before this panel. And the key for Barbados was beyond the policy, guarantee how to measure the importance of KPIs. And yesterday we had the launching of BitClima, is the new facility of the bank to pay for results related to climate and biodiversity. We had some ministers of finance here, but everybody talked about the importance of indicators, the importance of how to measure and to avoid greenwashing. And even with BitClima, the new facility, that's one of the 3 KPIs that we're going to include, is how we're going to measure impact to pay for results at year 5 of the operation that we're going to find. So I wanted to put this example that we're putting, then to start listening your perspectives from different angles that, as CB said, are complementary to what we require to have different stakeholders to advance in this agenda. So I'm going to start with Douglas. What we have done in the group, the intrinsic exchange group, is a fascinating story that I don't know if everybody knows. So I want you to share what you have done to being able to create a new asset class with the new, with the story that you have to share with the audience and what is next.
First off, thank you so much for IDB support. As Juan Pablo knows, 3 years ago, there was a very nascent idea that nature could be an asset class that could be traded at a capital market scale. And I'm often asked, why is the private sector not investing directly in nature? And the short answer is there really isn't a mechanism. So if you think about how we've looked at nature in the past, it was first inexhaustible. We can take as much as we want from it. It'll always be there. Then we realized that wasn't true. And we've moved towards regulation and policy. And that can include taxes all the way to the economic incentives of what I'd say are artificial markets. Carbon, other, where we're saying we want to have an offset and have an indirect investment. It's not quite yet investing all the way in nature. So when we talk about what's missing for the capital markets, you can look at it as there are plenty of capital sources that want to make a direct investment in nature and in climate. The problem is the majority of them have to meet a market rate of return for that investment. Many of them have a fiduciary responsibility, a legal requirement that they have to do it. So if you're saying you cannot have a less than market rate of return, it's very difficult for that capital to be employed. On the other side, and we go, why have corporations not, stepped up and filled that gap? And they are doing some work, but I can give you a couple of examples in the food sector. You can look at Danone and Manuel Faber when he was the chairman and CEO. He was ousted by a activist shareholder group that said, you're being too green. You're pushing this future of food, public benefit corporation, and you're not giving us the return on investment that we think you should be giving us. More recently, at Unilever, there was an activist shareholder group, and they said, for you to be moving forward with this regenerative and greener agriculture, what we want is meaningful profits, not purposeful mayonnaise. And that's led to another ouster indirectly out of a CEO that wanted to make those investments. So the blockage that we're looking at is truly investors who would like to make that investment. We have started, and I kind of likened it to a gasoline engine where you'd say governments, IDB, others, they put a little fuel in the tank. The engine starts, we start moving forward, and we're still talking about projects. We're not really talking about flipping the underlying problem that nature was excluded. That resource runs out because the natural system that we put together of how we value a corporation, how we create capital, is not including nature at the center. So what we came forward with a crazy idea that fortunately the IDB said, yes, we'd like to try this, is we created a new type of company called a natural asset company. And its purpose, its charter is different. And it's to maintain and to grow natural capital under its management. So a geographical area, it could be a conservation area, it can be a agricultural area or a mixed use area. And the corporation would then value not just the monetized revenue, be that carbon credits or traditional product sales, but thinking of that asset moving, we call it natural capital, which is a misnomer. It's actually a natural asset that we'd like to be capital, but it can't be traded. So it can't be turned into financial capital. So within this structure, what we've said is there's a two-part financial statement that would allow you to have traditional revenues reported, but also ecological performance, the flow of ecosystem services, the value of that in economic terms, the value of the underlying asset. Now, we went forward and got the New York Stock Exchange to partner with us to create a special listing section on the big board so that companies that were chartered to do this direct investment in nature could be approved for listing on the exchange under the SEC's rulemaking. We filed our rules with the SEC in October. If we're successful, by May, we would have approval for natural assets, the companies to come forward. So bringing in nature to the capital markets to unlock that missing trillions that we're looking at. Nature produces as large a GDP, a natural GDP, as our current financial GDP. Being able to include that into the financial system can power us to that circular economy and allow corporations and governments who have started the investment to move to a more traditional approach to investor returns, unlocking the capital structures for conservation and for changing our supply chains.
Thank you, Doug. So a great example of innovation, and I was very happy today you told us about the New York Stock Exchange and how you were advancing with the process. Akansha, speaking about another instrument, biodiversity credits. I think everybody's starting to talk about biodiversity credits, habitat banks. From the web, how are you seeing the evolution of this?
Sure. Maybe before I go into biodiversity credits, I think just reflecting quickly on what I heard so far. One, it was wonderful that in the opening remarks, 3 of the reports that I have worked on have been mentioned. So it always makes you feel happy. But those reports were really looking at making a macroeconomic case for why nature matters. Having done that and the success of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, we all acknowledge that the economic case is there. I think what most people are struggling with is what is the business case at the individual business unit. And I think that's what we need to figure out. And the second just general comment is we are also looking at a market failure here that we are trying to fix. Because today we just look at nature environment as an externality, which is nowhere reflected in the pricing or revenue that we do. So I think this panel, and the work that you're leading is super critical for advancing that agenda. Coming specifically to the biodiversity credit, I also sit on the UK-France International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits, and I co-chair the demand working group over there. And just yesterday, we at the World Economic Forum also released 2 reports, which is what are the demand drivers for biodiversity credits? Where will it actually come from? Who's going to buy it? And why will they buy it? And once they do decide to buy these credits, what should the claims and governance look like? So if I am buying a biodiversity credit for a particular project, my claim, frankly, should only be talking about that project and not extend to the entire global operations of a company. So the few things that we have seen so far, which could be the driver for biodiversity credits, is one, understanding what your internal mission is. And a lot of companies who are sort of the first movers in this space are coming to the table because either they have an enlightened CEO, not yet ousted, and really believes in it, or they recognize that they have a direct dependency, not only impact, a direct dependency on ecosystem services. So this would be mostly primary sectors, agriculture included. But then I think to Sylvie's point, which I fully agree with, is we need greater drivers which are external. And what that means is we need regulatory and government signal, which will make the biodiversity credits market grow. Because for the voluntary space alone, it really depends on, okay, if I feel like buying it because I believe in it, I can make a case to the CFO. It's just too many ifs and buts. But if you have the right signal from the government, and that's why meetings such as these ones are super critical, because then you can anchor it in a global framework that parties agree to. So in the same way that Target 19 in the Global Biodiversity Framework does. The other piece is looking at the reputational side of things as well, is companies are increasingly understanding that both in terms of connecting with potential employees as well as consumers, they need to be seen as not just net zero, it has to go beyond net zero into nature positive. And then the last piece is financial. I think a lot of people that I'm speaking with are recognizing that the cost to capital from their investors will be different if they start investing in nature. So we from the World Economic Forum are pulling together what we are calling a frontrunners coalition for biodiversity credits, is just a group of companies who want to understand what's in this space. How can they engage in it? How can they speak to experts where they genuinely have questions either about the projects, but also about the mechanism of how do you structure a deal? Just a very concrete example, a CSO said to me, how do I make a case to my chief financial officer to sign the check? So I think that's the work that we will be doing in the next year and two. But the message that biodiversity credits have to be part of the overall nature positive strategy for a company. It just cannot stand on its own for credibility and reputational reasons. And then for the project financing on the ground, it needs to be part of an overall financing structure, because on its own, just the numbers won't add up. So how do you take biodiversity credit to then catalyze funding for a larger project financing could be more interesting. So I'll stop over there, but thank you so much.
No, thank you, Akansha. And yesterday, we were talking about the importance of KPIs, Marcina, and some of the ministers of finance, we had at least 3 or 4 yesterday, when we talk about big climate, they said, okay, you are helping us to develop KPIs related to climate, to the MDCs. Now you're going to help us with big climate to define also KPIs related to biodiversity and nature. And they are starting to understand the complexity of this. So from your perspective, how would you support the KPI designation to measure biodiversity and nature in financing mechanisms?
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Marcine Mitchell. I'm the Senior Vice President for Climate Change at the World Wildlife Fund. And I'm particularly happy to be here today because I feel a connection to IDB. I come from, I've been in WWF for about 2.5 years, but I come from the IFC. And your president, James Scriven, and I worked together for years at the IFC. So my perspective is really on climate finance. You know, also being here at COP, one of the big issues that we're dealing with is the global stock take, which tells us, you know, that we are really far behind in terms of making the goals for climate and how important biodiversity is for that. The bad news is that we need to increase investment in nature, in biodiversity by 3 times. We need more by 2030 and quadruple the amount of investment we have in biodiversity by 2050. So we have a big, you know, challenge ahead of us. It's particularly important for Latin America because as you know, as you're probably very aware of, that 40% of the world's biodiversity is in Latin America, with 25 of the hotspots and 6 of the 17 mega diverse areas, countries. And so that's really important. It also, you heard earlier today, a quote from the World Wildlife's annual report about the decline in species. Overall, globally, 67% decline in species since 1970, 67% globally. In Latin America, LAC, 94% decrease. So we have a challenge. So coming back to KPIs, though, what's important is you're going to need KPIs in order to attract the finance that is necessary. And, you know, climate, the thing about climate is fairly straightforward. You know, you're really looking at carbon, right? And so it's kind of one metric. Biodiversity, by its nature, is multidimensional and complex, right? And so there are all these interdependencies and interconnections between species and ecosystems. And so it is very difficult for often the finance world and even your stakeholders to understand, what does success look like? What does that mean? And so again, having metrics and KPIs are very, very important for attracting finance and for getting your communities, your stakeholders to understand what success looks like. So let me give you an example. So WWF, along with TNC, the Pew Charitable Trust, and Zumba Foundation, which is the Walton family, has launched this initiative called the Project Finance for Permanence model. And the idea behind that is to mobilize long-term sustainable finance for nature-based solutions at scale. So this, we call it PFP model. The idea is to secure upfront, in a single closing upfront, all from a broad array of funders, public and private, government and philanthropic, all the money that you need to secure permanent funding for a specific area. This gives the governments a chance, by bringing this money all up front, it gives the governments a chance to put in sustainable long-term financing over a period of time. And it's not every year you're going and looking for new financing to maintain this area. It's all up front. So in Latin America, one good example is Herencia Colombia initiative. It's a broad coalition. It's 245 million, just closed. It protects 32 million hectares of iconic Colombian landscapes. And it's also part of regional PFPs that altogether protect 12% of the Amazon. So this is at scale. This is big time. The Colombian government over time is putting in a financing, permanent financing through a fixed portion of carbon taxes over time, but you also have international financing like GCF, which is putting in 43 million, philanthropy, and the private sector, all coming together to secure this landscape in Colombia and in the Amazon over time. But the key to this are the KPIs, because the KPIs are what release the targets. The targets release the funding over time. So hitting those targets allows you to release this funding. And that's why having key performance indicators are really, really important. That's what makes it work. So you have to have those clear definitions. And we're informed by the global biodiversity framework and also the science-based target network in terms of how you define those KPIs. The second thing that I'd like to say is the KPIs need to be both specific to the area that you're working in, but they also need a second layer of having global metrics, so then you can compare projects across. You can compare what's happening in Colombia to what's happening in Peru. If you're bringing in international financing like GCF, you compare what's happening in Peru, what's happening to Mexico. So you need both layers, specific and international. And then just two other points I'd like to make that we should be thinking about. Many times when we're putting together our KPIs, and this is particularly for conservationists, we're not thinking about the impact of climate on our landscapes. You know, we know what to do in terms of conservation, but we're not really trained in terms of what are the long-term impacts of what climate is going to do to those due to those landscapes. And so we need to incorporate that into our impacts. Another example of that is that WWF is partnering with Google to with a project we call Manglaria, which is basically a mangroves project and AI. So that's how in Spanish, Manglaria. It's 2 landscapes in Mexico, and Google is helping us put in sensors, put in using weather stations, using drones, testing for the temperature, salinity, all the type of things that impact the mangroves, so that we know over time when we're doing our conservation, what species are most resilient? Where should we plant them? How do we maintain them? We need that information because our climate no longer is this stable thing that we can count on, that we can look back in history and know. We need to be able to look forward. So as people are putting together their KPIs, one, it's use technology. There's so much great technology out there that can be used. And then 2, look forward, not backwards, in terms of what your KPIs. And then my very final point is, as we're developing this, I talked about the local KPIs and the global KPIs, but it's very, very important that some of the KPIs are located and focused on community benefit, right? Particularly if you're getting climate money. So people tend to say, oh, climate money, let's just focus on carbon, right? But to be sustainable, to really last, this has to make sense to the people who are in these landscapes. It has to have benefits to the people who are in these benefits. So for this example of a Manglaria with the mangroves, we're looking at not only KPIs about carbon sequestration, but also what is the growth in fishing? Because mangroves are, what do you call it for little fishes? They nurseries. Thank you. I do speak English, yes. Nurseries for fishery. So, but that's the economic value for that community. Mangroves also protect communities from sea level rise or saltwater incursion or storm surges. So we need to measure those things, because that's what you come back to your communities and say, yeah, it's carbon, we're saving the world, but we're also saving your communities. We're also bringing in value to you through fishing. We're also bringing in tourism, right? So that's my final word, is to say KPIs have to do so many different things: unleash financing, be global, but also be local.
Excellent, Marcina. And it shows the link of nature in a very integral way with many things. And Sylvia, listening to Marcina, I think the working together, MDBs with NGOs, is going to be every day more important. With WWF in Herencia Colombia, IDB Lab also support the Eco Colombia platform to start linking potential projects as part of that process. But at the same time with TNC, we did the Theme Nature for Barbados. It was a key work. And I'm very happy that Fabio Arjona, the Director of Conservation International Colombia, is here. They have an amazing example of blue carbon of mangroves with Apple in Colombia that now we're supporting to scale that work. And it's very similar to what you were mentioning. It's the link with communities, fisheries, but climate and biodiversity together. So just showing how MDBs has to work together with all of us, I think is also a great example of the moving forward. And to finalize, now we're going to have another champion CEO. That is Alejandro Costa from Colombia. He's the CEO of a big port in Antioquia. And I would like to give you the word and tell us how, in a big project like this one, you decided to start pushing biocredits, habitat banks, being nature positive investments, and congratulations. I mean, your leadership has been very important, Alejandro.
Thank you for that, and thank you for inviting me to present what we're doing over there. Because as you mentioned before, we are in a very complex region, very complex region. We are located in a biographic transition zone because we are connecting North America and Central America with South America in that specific region. So it's a highest priority corridor for global conservation. It's a region that is 2% of the surface of the planet, but it's almost 10% of biodiversity. So it's quite challenging investing there, just from biodiversity perspective. On top of that, we have a community of 40,000 inhabitants with very basic and needs. So what you were describing before is the challenge that we had there. And we were looking for the solution, how to work on that, how to really make a difference. And this is the way to make a difference, the Habitat Bank and all the process that we're discussing. But the key element here is for us as a company to understand that the standard approach followed by our industry, which is mainly focused in complying with the legal requirements of the environmental license, is not enough. Because usually if we do that, we cannot really measure the net gains on biodiversity, and we go to the KPIs. So we need to make sure that the solution that we were implementing there was able to approach and tackle the complexity that we have in the region from social and environmental perspective. You were talking about the mangroves. To give you an idea, and in the last 5 years, we lost in the region 45% of the 5,700 hectares of mangroves, with a potential retention capacity of 120,000 CO2 tons per year. But on top of that, what you mentioned before, the mangroves is not only carbon retention, it's also the nursery for the fishes, the seafood, and also the biological filter for water and air. So when you see all that combination of elements, you see, okay, what to do? So, and that is when the IDB comes into the game and really is helping us to structure an instrument to combining all those elements to develop the appropriate methodology and governance, but including the relevant KPIs to be able to measure the net gain of biodiversity. But how to tackle that? How to measure the net gain? How to measure the KPIs involving the community? Is the only way. Because it's a so large region that if they don't see the value for them, if we don't create quality jobs, if we don't create co-benefits for them, they won't be able. So it will be a disaster, let's say. So the Habitat Bank is the perfect solution for the region that we have, which is very sensible from an environmental perspective, but from social perspective too. When you are building a port, which is going to run at least for 30 years, which is the concession, you need to make sure that it's sustainable in the long run. It's not something that we are going to fund every year. It's not something that is going to abandon in 2-3 years. We need to make sure that the system that we are creating is really able to be sustainable and economically viable, to be able to survive and to demonstrate net gain for 30 years, which is the concession. And that's the challenge of the biocredits. Because the biocredits is we receive the benefit of the biocredits just when the KPIs are met, the specific ones. It's not money in advance or free. We need to really demonstrate that to receive the money to be able to sustain the Habitat Bank. But that challenge is the beauty of the system, because having everybody, all the parties aligned towards that goal, allow us to work in the same direction and to make sure that it's sustainable for the long run, which is our goal. So it's what we're doing over there.
Thank you. I have some signs that we have to end, but to close, I think that big challenge that we have is how to value capital at the public level. Yesterday at the conversation with ministers of finance, they with mayors, many of them were saying how we can include the value of nature into our decision making, to do exactly many of the things that you have told in the panel. And we said we need to advance not only value biodiversity at the national level into national accounts. We're starting to work with the Central Bank of Chile to do that. But I think working with ministries of finance and environment together to start valuing natural capital, I think is the only way to then being able to start incorporating that into sustainable infrastructure and many of the things that you described for that. So as a bank, what the IDB president is telling us that as a group, we need to start working together. That's why the example that you're provided, VidInvest is supporting you, but we need from the public side to see what the country is doing also in terms of regulation. All the extrinsic value exchange was supported by BidLab, the innovation lab of the bank, but now the challenge is how to scale that up. And it's fascinating to see the conversation about KPIs and how we can work together with different institutions like yours, CI, TNC in the future, but at the same time to partner with great institutions like WEF to advance in this agenda. So thanks everybody. I think this has been a fascinating conversation and look forward to continue working with all of you.